Elderly man saves the life of George Strait and 127 people on flight. What George Strait did moved the nation. The worn leather wallet contained exactly $47.32. Harold Mitchell counted the crumpled bills for the third time that morning, his weathered fingers trembling slightly as he smoothed each one against the scratched surface of his kitchen table. The electric bill lay unopened beside yesterday's newspaper, its red "Final Notice" stamp glaring like an accusation through the thin envelope window. At 78 years old, Harold had learned to prioritize survival over comfort, but today was different. Today he was finally going to see Jimmy. The flight confirmation email glowed on the ancient laptop screen, the device so old it took nearly 10 minutes to boot up each morning. American Airlines Flight 327, departing Dallas-Fort Worth at 2:15 in the afternoon, arriving in Los Angeles at 4:45 Pacific Time. Economy class, seat 34F. The last row, squeezed between the bathroom and the galley, where the smell of reheated meals would assault his already sensitive stomach. Harold didn't care. After saving every spare penny for 8 months, cutting back on groceries and walking everywhere to save gas money, he had finally scraped together enough for this pilgrimage. The photograph on his nightstand showed 2 young men in Air Force uniforms, their arms draped around each other, shoulders, grins wide beneath their caps. Harold picked up the frame, his thumb tracing the glass over Jimmy's face. Captain James Rodriguez had been more than his wingman during those terrifying months over Vietnam. Jimmy had been the brother Harold never had, the friend who pulled him through the darkest moments when their squadron lost 3 planes in a single week. They had promised each other they would grow old together, sharing war stories with their grandchildren. But Jimmy never made it past 26. The cancer had taken Jimmy just 2 years ago, and Harold had missed the funeral. Not because he didn't want to be there, but because he simply couldn't afford the trip. His disability check barely covered rent and medication, and after his wife Martha passed 5 years earlier, Harold found himself increasingly isolated in the small apartment that felt more like a prison with each passing day. The guilt had eaten at him, worse than the arthritis in his hands, worse than the hearing loss that made conversations a constant struggle. If you'd be watching this story and it's touching your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you'll be watching from. Your support helps us share more inspiring stories like Harold is, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on this incredible journey we're about to witness together. Harold folded his only decent shirt, the navy blue one Martha had bought him for their 50th wedding anniversary. The fabric had faded and the collar was slightly frayed, but it was clean and pressed. He placed it carefully in the battered suitcase that had traveled with him to 3 different military bases and 4 different apartments over the decades. The case was older than some of the flight attendants who would be working his flight, its corners reinforced with duct tape and its handle wrapped in athletic tape to prevent the sharp edges from cutting his palms. The taxi ride to the airport cost $18, a significant portion of his remaining funds, but Harold's old Honda had finally given up the ghost last month. The mechanic had quoted him $1,200 for repairs on a car worth maybe $300. Harold had simply nodded, taken his keys, and walked home. Public transportation in Dallas was limited, and at his age, the bus routes were more of an adventure than he cared to navigate with a suitcase. Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport buzzed with the usual chaos of afternoon departures. Harold moved slowly through the security checkpoint, his metal knee replacements triggering the detector and requiring additional screening. The TSA agent, a young woman with purple fingernails and an expression of barely contained impatience, waved a metal detecting wand over his body with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times. "Any medical devices, sir?" she asked, not really looking at him. "Just the knees," Harold replied, his voice carrying the rasp of a man who had inhaled too much smoke and dust during his military service. "Got them replaced after a helicopter crash in '73. The agent S. expression softened slightly. Military, Air Force, 22 years. She completed her inspection with a bit more care, her movements gentler as she checked his shoes and belt. "I thank you for your service," she said, and for the first time in their interaction, she made eye contact. Harold nodded, accepting the gratitude with the same quiet dignity he had carried through decades of being overlooked and underappreciated. He had stopped expecting recognition long ago, had learned to find satisfaction in simply having done his duty. But the young woman's acknowledgement still warmed something inside his chest, a small reminder that his service had meant something to someone. Gate A18 was a 20-minute walk through the terminal, past overpriced restaurants and shops selling travel pillows that cost more than Harold spent on groceries in a week. He found a seat near the boarding area and watched the other passengers. Business travelers typed furiously on laptops, their expensive suits and confident postures marking them as people who flew regularly, who considered air travel as routine as driving to the grocery store. Families wrangled children and carried enough luggage for month-long expeditions. College students sprawled across multiple seats, earbuds blocking out the world around them. Harold noticed things others missed. It was a habit formed during his military years when situational awareness could mean the difference between life and death. He observed the nervous businessman who kept checking his phone and wiping his palms on his pants. The mother traveling alone with twin toddlers, her eyes darting between her children and the departure board with the exhausted vigilance of someone operating on 3 hours of sleep. The elderly woman in the wheelchair, her daughter fussing over her with the kind of anxious attention that suggested this might be their last trip together. But it was the man in the cowboy hat who caught Harold's attention. He sat in the first-class boarding area, dressed casually in jeans and a simple white button-down shirt, but there was something familiar about his profile. Harold's eyesight wasn't what it used to be, but he had spent enough evenings watching country music performances on his old television to recognize that distinctive silhouette. George Strait, the king of country music himself, was apparently taking the same flight to Los Angeles. Harold almost smiled at the irony. Here he was, scraping together his last dollars to visit a grave, sitting 50 feet away from a man who probably made more money in a single concert than Harold had seen in the past decade. But there was no bitterness in the observation, no resentment. Harold had learned long ago that life wasn't fair, that good people sometimes struggled while others prospered, and that the only thing a man could control was how he responded to his circumstances. The boarding announcement crackled through the gate area speakers, distorted and barely comprehensible through the ambient noise of the terminal. Harold gathered his small carry-on bag, a canvas messenger bag that contained his medication, Jimmy's letters from Vietnam, and a small bouquet of artificial flowers he planned to leave at the grave. Real flowers would have been nicer, but they were expensive and would have wilted during the flight. As the boarding process began, Harold watched George Strait disappear down the jetway with the other first-class passengers. The country star moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to preferential treatment, but Harold noticed he took time to sign an autograph for a gate agent and posed for a quick selfie with a fan who recognized him. Class and humility, Harold thought. Martha would have liked that. When his boarding group was finally called, Harold made his way down the narrow aisle of the Boeing 737, past the spacious first-class seats where George Strait was already settled with a book, past the business-class section with its slightly wider seats and extra legroom, all the way to the back of the plane where the seats were cramped and the overhead bins were already stuffed with other passengers' belongings. Seat 34F was exactly as advertised, a window seat in the last row, squeezed between the lavatory and the galley. The seat didn't recline, the window was scratched and yellowed with age, and the proximity to the bathroom promised an aromatic journey. Harold stored his bag in the overhead compartment, squeezing it between an oversized roller bag and someone's winter coat, then settled into his seat. The passenger in 34E was a young man in his 20s, wearing expensive headphones and typing rapidly on a tablet. He glanced up when Harold sat down, offered a perfunctory nod, then immediately returned to his screen. The middle seat remained empty as passengers continued boarding, and Harold allowed himself a small hope that it might stay that way. As the plane filled up, Harold watched the controlled chaos of travelers finding their seats, stowing luggage, and settling in for the 3-hour flight. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, helping passengers and conducting their pre-flight safety checks. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming passengers aboard and providing the usual information about weather, flight time, and cruising altitude. Harold had heard similar announcements thousands of times during his military career and the handful of commercial flights he had taken over the years. But today, something in the captain's voice caught his attention. A slight tension, perhaps, or a hesitation that most passengers would never notice. Harold's trained ear detected the subtle signs of stress that pilots learned to mask but never completely eliminate. The plane pushed back from the gate exactly on time, and Harold felt the familiar sensation of movement as they began the taxi to the runway. Through his scratched window, he watched the ground crew directing traffic and the endless parade of aircraft in various stages of arrival and departure. Dallas-Fort Worth was one of the busiest airports in the world, a testament to humanity's determination to move through space at speeds that would have seemed impossible to his grandfather's generation. As they waited in line for takeoff, Harold closed his eyes and thought about Jimmy. The cemetery in Los Angeles was called Forest Lawn, and according to the information Harold had found online, Jimmy's grave was in the veterans section, marked by a simple military headstone. Harold had written down the plot number on a piece of paper tucked into his wallet, along with directions from the airport to the cemetery and the schedule for public transportation. He planned to spend the night in a budget motel near the airport, visit Jimmy's grave the next morning, and fly back to Dallas in the afternoon. 2 days away from his apartment, 2 days that would consume most of his remaining savings, but 2 days that might finally allow him to say goodbye properly to the man who had saved his life more times than he could count. The engines roared to life as Flight 327 began its takeoff roll down runway 18 right. Harold felt the familiar pressure as the aircraft accelerated, the sensation bringing back memories of countless military flights from decades past. But as they climbed through 10,000 feet, something subtle caught his attention. A barely perceptible vibration in the floor beneath his feet, so faint that none of the other passengers seemed to notice. Harold's experienced senses, honed by years of flying in conditions where mechanical problems could mean death, detected what civilian travelers would dismiss as normal turbulence. The flight leveled off at 37,000 feet, and the seatbelt sign clicked off with its familiar chime. Most passengers immediately reached for their phones, books, or tablets, settling into the routine of a cross-country flight. The young man beside Harold resumed his frantic typing, his fingers dancing across the tablet screen with the urgency of someone racing against a deadline. Flight attendants began preparing the beverage service, their practiced movements navigating the narrow aisles with the efficiency of years of experience. Harold tried to relax, but something nagged at him. The vibration had stopped, but now there was an almost imperceptible change in the engine sound. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would alarm passengers. But Harold had spent too many years listening to aircraft engines under stress to ignore his instincts. He glanced around the cabin, noting that everyone else seemed perfectly content, lost in their own worlds of entertainment and distraction. In first class, George Strait appeared to be reading a book, occasionally glancing out the window at the landscape passing below. The country star looked relaxed, comfortable in the wider seat with its generous legroom and privacy. Harold wondered what it would be like to travel that way, to board a plane without counting every dollar, to make decisions based on comfort rather than necessity. But the thought wasn't bitter or envious. Harold had learned long ago that happiness wasn't measured by seat assignments or account balances. 20 minutes into the flight, Harold noticed something else. A faint odor, barely detectable above the usual airplane smells of recycled air and industrial carpet. It was metallic, sharp, reminiscent of overheated machinery. Harold had smelled it before, during a terrifying incident over Da Nang, when their B-52 had developed hydraulic problems that nearly sent them into the South China Sea. The memory made his pulse quicken, but he forced himself to remain calm. The flight attendant passing through the cabin was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who had dealt with every type of passenger imaginable. Harold caught her attention as she approached his row. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice low and controlled. "I am a former military pilot, and I am detecting some unusual sounds and smells. Has the crew mentioned any mechanical issues?" The flight attendant paused, her professional smile faltering slightly. "I haven't heard anything, sir, but I can check with the cockpit if you are reconcerned." "I still appreciate that," Harold replied. "It is probably nothing, but in my experience it's better to be cautious." The flight attendant nodded and continued toward the front of the plane. Harold watched her go, noting the way she moved with slightly more urgency than before. His concern was beginning to spread, even if she didn't fully understand why. 30 minutes into the flight, as Harold was beginning to think his concerns were unfounded, the plane shuddered. It was a turbulence. Harold had experienced enough rough air to know the difference between atmospheric disturbance and mechanical problems. This was something happening inside the aircraft itself, something that made the entire structure vibrate in a way that aircraft weren't designed to vibrate. Other passengers began to notice. Conversations quieted as people looked around nervously. The young man beside Harold finally looked up from his tablet, his eyebrows furrowed with concern. In the galley, Harold could see flight attendants exchanging worried glances, their casual efficiency replaced by alert attention. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're re-experiencing some minor technical difficulties. As a precautionary measure, we're going to descend to a lower altitude. Please return to your seats and fasten your seat belts." Harold's blood ran cold. In pilot speak, minor technical difficulties often meant something far more serious than passengers realized. The request to return to seats and fasten seat belts suggested the crew was preparing for potential turbulence or emergency maneuvers. Harold's hands, which had been steady despite his age, began to tremble slightly. The descent was steeper than normal, and Harold felt his ears pop as the cabin pressure adjusted. Around him, passengers were beginning to show signs of real concern. The casual chatter had stopped entirely, replaced by nervous whispers and worried glances toward the windows. Parents pulled children closer, and business travelers abandoned their laptops to grip their armrests. Then the smell became stronger. The metallic odor Harold had noticed earlier was now unmistakable, accompanied by something that reminded him of burning electronics. Harold had experienced catastrophic system failures before, and he recognized the signs of an aircraft in serious distress. His military training kicked in, and he began mentally reviewing emergency procedures, even though he was just a passenger with no authority or access to the controls. The plane shuddered again, more violently this time, and several passengers gasped audibly. Harold could see flight attendants moving through the cabin with forced calm, their professional training keeping them composed even as their eyes betrayed their growing concern. In first class, he noticed George Strait had put down his book and was looking around with the alert attention of someone who had spent enough time on aircraft to recognize when something was seriously wrong. 45 minutes into the flight, the impossible happened. Warning bells began ringing in the cockpit, loud enough to be heard throughout the cabin. Harold's heart sank as he recognized the particular pattern of alarms. Multiple system failures were occurring simultaneously, the kind of cascading emergency that turned routine flights into disasters. The Captain S voice returned, and this time the professional calm was strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have lost some of our hydraulic systems and are experiencing navigation difficulties. We're going to continue our descent and attempt to land at the nearest available airport. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for emergency landing procedures." The words hit the passenger cabin like a physical blow. Someone screamed. A child began crying. The business travelers who had seemed so confident and important suddenly looked as frightened and helpless as everyone else. Harold watched it all with the detached clarity that came from having faced death before, but his mind was racing through possibilities and procedures. Emergency landing procedures meant the situation was critical. Loss of hydraulic systems could affect flight controls, landing gear, and braking systems. Navigation difficulties suggested problems with instruments and guidance systems. Harold had seen aircraft attempt emergency landings under similar conditions during the war, and the success rate wasn't encouraging. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, demonstrating emergency positions and reviewing evacuation procedures. Their voices remained steady and professional, but Harold could see the fear in their eyes. These were experienced crew members who had practiced these procedures hundreds of times, but hoped never to use them. The fact that they were implementing emergency protocols meant the situation was far worse than the Captain S announcement suggested. As passengers around him panicked, Harold found himself entering a strange state of calm. It was the same mental clarity he had experienced during combat missions, when adrenaline and training combined to create a heightened awareness of everything happening around him. He began studying the cabin layout, noting exit locations and estimating distances. Old habits from military survival training were asserting themselves automatically. The young man beside him was no longer typing. His tablet lay forgotten in his lap as he gripped his armrest with white knuckles. Harold placed a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder. "What's your name, son?" Harold asked quietly. "Marcus," the young man replied, his voice tight with fear. "Marcus, I told Harold. I've been through situations like this before. The crew knows what they're doing, and modern aircraft are designed to handle multiple system failures. Try to stay calm and listen to the flight attendants." Marcus nodded, seeming to draw some comfort from Harold's steady presence. Around them, other passengers were in various stages of panic and prayer. Harold could hear someone sobbing in the row behind him, and a man across the aisle was speaking rapidly into his phone, trying to reach his family before they lost cell coverage. The plane continued its descent, and Harold felt the change in engine sound that indicated they were configuring for landing. But something was wrong with the descent rate. They were coming down too fast, and the aircraft felt unstable, like a car with alignment problems pulling to one side. Harold's experience told him the pilots were fighting to maintain control. Then came the announcement that chilled Harold's blood. "Ladies and gentlemen, our co-pilot has suffered a medical emergency and is unable to assist with the landing. We are doing everything possible to ensure a safe arrival at our alternate airport." One pilot, multiple system failures, an aircraft that was barely under control. Harold had seen this scenario before, and he knew the statistical probability of survival. It wasn't good. Around him, passengers who had been frightened before were now genuinely terrified. The crying had become wailing, and several people were openly praying. But Harold's mind was working differently. Instead of focusing on the danger, he was analyzing the situation from a pilot's perspective. What would he do if he were in the cockpit right now? What procedures would give them the best chance of survival? His hands itched to be on the controls, to be doing something useful instead of sitting helplessly in the back of the plane. The aircraft shuddered again, and this time Harold felt the unmistakable sensation of a plane fighting its pilot S inputs. The captain was struggling to maintain control, probably dealing with degraded flight controls and unreliable instruments. Harold closed his eyes and tried to remember everything he knew about emergency procedures for the type of aircraft they were flying. When he opened his eyes, he noticed George Strait looking back toward the economy section. The country star S. gaze met Harold S. for a moment, and Harold saw recognition in the younger man S. eyes. Not recognition of Harold specifically, but recognition of someone who understood what was happening, someone who wasn't panicking like the other passengers. Harold made a decision that would change everything. Despite his age, despite the risk of being dismissed as a confused old man, despite the protocol that prohibited passengers from interfering with flight operations, he was going to try to help. Because somewhere in the cockpit, a pilot was fighting alone to save 128 lives, and Harold possessed knowledge that might make the difference between survival and catastrophe. Harold unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up slowly, his arthritic joints protesting after 45 minutes of tension. The flight attendant who had spoken with him earlier was helping secure loose items in the galley, her movements quick and efficient, despite the aircraft's increasingly erratic behavior. Harold approached her carefully, not wanting to startle her in an already stressful situation. Harold said, his voice calm but urgent. "I need to speak with the captain immediately. I have extensive experience with emergency procedures that might help in this situation." The flight attendant looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but passengers need to remain in their seats. The cockpit is restricted and we can allow—" "Not just any passenger," Harold interrupted gently but firmly. "I flew B-52s over Vietnam for 4 tours. I've dealt with multiple hydraulic failures, navigation system breakdowns, and single-pilot emergency landings. That pilot up there is fighting alone, and I might be able to help." The flight attendant hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and the growing desperation of their situation. The plane lurched suddenly to the left, throwing both of them against the galley wall. Through the cockpit door, they could hear the captain's strained voice communicating with air traffic control, reporting their deteriorating condition and requesting immediate clearance to the nearest airport. "Please," Harold continued, his hand steady on her arm, "I'm not asking to take control. I am asking to assist. 22 years of military flying experience might be exactly what your captain needs right now." Before the flight attendant could respond, George Strait appeared beside them. The country star had moved from first class with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting things done. His presence immediately changed the dynamic of the conversation. "Excuse me," George said, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being listened to. "I couldn't help but overhear. This gentleman says he's a military pilot?" Harold nodded. "Retired Air Force, Colonel Harold Mitchell." George's expression shifted to one of respect and determination. I don't know much about flying, but I do know about veterans, and I've seen enough of them to recognize the real thing. If Colonel Mitchell thinks he can help, maybe we should let him try." The flight attendant looked between the two men, her training warring with the reality of their desperate situation. Another violent shudder ran through the aircraft, and this time the lights flickered ominously. In the passenger cabin, the crying had become more intense, and Harold could hear someone being sick in the bathroom behind him. "I'll need to ask the captain," she said finally. "Yes, but sir, if you were wrong about this, if you interfere with flight operations—" "If I am wrong, we'd probably not going to survive anyway," Harold replied quietly. "But if I am right, I might be able to help save everyone on this plane." George placed a supportive hand on Harold's shoulder. "I'll take responsibility," he told the flight attendant. "Whatever consequences come from this decision, they on me." The flight attendant nodded reluctantly and moved toward the cockpit door. Harold could see her speaking into her headset, presumably communicating with the captain about the unusual request. The conversation seemed to go on forever, though it was probably only 30 seconds. Finally, she returned with a grim expression. "The captain will see you," she said, "but he wants to make it clear that any interference with flight operations could result in federal charges." Harold nodded soberly. "I understand." The cockpit of the Boeing 737 was a maze of switches, displays, and warning lights. Harold had never flown this specific aircraft type, but the basic principles of flight control were universal, and he could see immediately that the situation was worse than he had imagined. The captain, a man in his 40s with sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool cabin air, looked up as Harold entered. "You are the military pilot?" he asked without preamble. "Colonel Harold Mitchell, retired Air Force. What is your situation, Captain?" "Dave Peterson," the captain replied, then launched into a rapid assessment. "We've lost primary and backup hydraulic systems. Flight controls are responding, but barely. Navigation system is giving us conflicting readings. Co-pilot had what looked like a heart attack 20 minutes ago." He gestured toward the unconscious man slumped in the right seat. "I am flying on manual control with partial instruments, and I am not sure I can get us down safely." Harold studied the instrument panel, his experienced eyes quickly interpreting the cascade of warning lights and abnormal readings. It was worse than the captain had described. They weren't just dealing with multiple system failures. They were dealing with a perfect storm of mechanical problems that could have come straight from a pilot's worst nightmare. "What is your flight control response like?" Harold asked, moving closer to examine the primary flight display. "Sluggish. I have to fight it constantly to maintain heading and altitude. It feels like the control surfaces are only partially responding." Harold nodded grimly. "I've seen this before. You've got what we used to call cascade failure. One system goes down, it affects another, which affects another. The good news is that this aircraft is designed to fly with degraded systems. The bad news is that you need to fly it differently than you normally would." Captain Peterson looked at Harold with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "What do you mean?" "In Vietnam, we had a B-52 that lost most of its hydraulic systems over Hanoi. The pilot tried to fly it normally and nearly killed all of us. What saved us was treating it like a completely different aircraft. Different power settings, different control inputs, different approach speeds." Harold studied the instruments more carefully, his mind racing through possibilities. "What's your current altitude and speed?" 22,000 feet, descending. Speed is 260 knots, but it keeps wanting to increase." "You're fighting the aircraft instead of working with it," Harold observed. "So with degraded hydraulics, you need to use power and trim to control descent rate instead of relying primarily on elevator input. Think of it like flying a glider with an engine." Captain Peterson's eyes widened slightly. "We never flown a glider." "Then think of it like flying a truck instead of a sports car. Everything has to be smoother, more gradual, with more advanced planning." Harold pointed to the power levers. "May I?" Peterson hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Harold's hands, steady despite his age, moved to the throttles with the confidence of decades of experience. He made small, precise adjustments, and immediately the aircraft's behavior changed. The constant fighting sensation eased, and the descent rate became more controlled. "How did you know to do that?" Peterson asked, amazement clear in his voice. "Experience with damaged aircraft. In combat, you learn to fly planes that aren't supposed to fly. This bird is hurt, but she was not dead. We just need to speak her language." Harold continued studying the instruments, his mind processing information with the clarity that came from having faced similar situations under even more challenging circumstances. The navigation problems were serious, but not insurmountable. The flight control issues were manageable if approached correctly. But they still faced the challenge of landing an aircraft with uncertain braking capability and potentially compromised landing gear. "What is your destination airport?" Harold asked. "Oklahoma City. We're about 40 minutes out at current speed." Harold shook his head. Too far. With these system failures, every minute in the air increases our risk. What is the closest airport with sufficient runway length? Peterson consulted his chart. Tulsa International. 25 minutes if we maintain current course and speed. Perfect. Radio ahead and tell them we need emergency equipment standing by. Full foam trucks, medical personnel, the works. Also request that they clear all other traffic. We're going to need a long, straight approach with no distractions. As Peterson made the radio calls, Harold continued his assessment of the aircraft's condition. The situation was critical but not hopeless. With careful handling and a bit of luck, they could get the plane on the ground safely. But it would require flying techniques that weren't taught in standard commercial aviation training. George Strait appeared in the cockpit doorway, having convinced the flight attendant to let him observe. "How are we doing?" he asked quietly. "Better than we were 5 minutes ago," Harold replied without taking his eyes off the instruments. "But we're not out of danger yet." The country star nodded, then surprised both pilots by asking, "Is there anything I can do to help? I know I am not a pilot, but I am good at following instructions." Harold considered the offer. "Actually, yes. We need someone to keep the passengers calm and informed. They were panicking back there, and if we hit turbulence during approach, we need them to follow instructions immediately." George nodded and disappeared back into the cabin. Within minutes, Harold could hear his distinctive voice over the passenger address system, calm and reassuring, explaining the situation in terms that conveyed confidence without minimizing the seriousness of their circumstances. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is George Strait. I know this isn't at how any of us planned to spend our afternoon, but I want you to know that we have an exceptional pilot team working to get us safely on the ground. We also have a retired Air Force colonel up here who is helping with procedures he learned during his military service. What we need from you is to stay calm, follow the flight attendant's instructions, and trust that everyone up here is doing everything possible to ensure our safety." The effect was immediate. Harold could sense the change in cabin atmosphere even from the cockpit. Having a familiar, trusted voice providing reassurance was exactly what the frightened passengers needed. But more than that, George's message had accomplished something else. It had given the passengers hope without making promises that might not be kept. Harold turned his attention back to the approach procedures. They were now 15 minutes from Tulsa, and every decision from this point forward would be critical. The aircraft was still responding to control inputs, but the responses were increasingly sluggish and unpredictable. They would have one chance to get the landing right, because a go-around with these system failures would be nearly impossible. "Captain," Harold said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. How many emergency landings have you performed in your career?" Peterson looked uncomfortable. "None. I've practiced them in simulators, but I've never actually had to perform one." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "Simulators are good, but they can replicate the psychological pressure of a real emergency. When we start our final approach, you're going to experience sensations and see instrument readings that don't match anything from your training. I need you to trust my guidance, even if it feels wrong." "I understand," Peterson replied, though Harold could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "Good, because the next 20 minutes are going to determine whether we all walk away from this or whether we become a statistic." The approach to Tulsa International Airport began with Harold's hands, guiding Captain Peterson through power adjustments that felt counterintuitive, but worked with the damaged aircraft's compromised systems. The runway appeared in the distance, a thin line of concrete that seemed impossibly narrow from their current altitude of 8,000 feet. Harold had performed emergency landings before, but never as a passenger trying to coach another pilot through procedures that required split-second timing and absolute precision. "Reduce power gradually," Harold instructed, his voice steady despite the gravity of their situation. "Don't fight the nose-down tendency. Use it to control your descent rate, but be ready to add power if we start dropping too fast." Captain Peterson's hands were trembling slightly on the controls, but he followed Harold's guidance with growing confidence. The aircraft responded differently than normal, requiring constant small corrections to maintain the proper glide path. Through the cockpit windows, they could see emergency vehicles positioned along the runway, their red and blue lights creating a colorful parade of potential disaster response. George Strait had returned to the cockpit doorway, his presence somehow providing additional calm to the tense atmosphere. Harold noticed that the country star was watching the proceedings with the intense focus of someone who understood that lives hung in the balance of every decision being made in the next few minutes. 6,000 feet, Captain Peterson announced, his voice tight with concentration. Harold monitored the instruments carefully, noting subtle changes in the aircraft's behavior as they descended. The hydraulic system failures meant that control response would continue to degrade as they approached landing speed, making the final approach increasingly challenging. They would have one opportunity to get this right, because the aircraft's condition made a go-around virtually impossible. "How are we doing back there?" Harold called to George, wanting to ensure passenger preparation was proceeding smoothly. "Flight attendants have everyone in brace position," George reported. "People are scared, but they following instructions. That young man who was sitting next to you asked me to tell you thank you for keeping him calm earlier." Harold felt a brief warmth in his chest at the message, but he couldn't allow himself to be distracted from the critical task at hand. They were now 5,000 feet above the airport, and every foot of altitude brought new challenges as the aircraft's damaged systems struggled to maintain stable flight. "Captain, I need you to start configuring for landing," Harold said. "But we were going to do it differently than normal. Instead of full flaps, we're going to use partial configuration. The hydraulic problems mean full flaps might not respond properly, and if they deploy asymmetrically, we could lose control entirely." Peterson nodded and began the landing configuration process with careful, deliberate movements. Each switch activation was announced and confirmed, a procedure Harold remembered from his military days when mechanical failures made every system activation a potential source of new problems. The landing gear extended with a series of mechanical thuds that reverberated through the aircraft structure, and Harold felt a moment of relief when the gear down indicators showed 3 green lights. "Gear down and locked," Peterson announced. "Good. Now maintain current power setting and let the aircraft settle into its natural descent rate. Don T, try to force it to behave like a normal airplane." At 3,000 feet, Harold could see the details of the airport below. Fire trucks were positioned at intervals along the runway, their foam cannons ready to deploy if needed. Ambulances waited near the terminal building, and Harold could see that the airport had been cleared of all other traffic. The sight of the emergency preparations was both reassuring and sobering. It confirmed that their situation was being taken seriously, but it also emphasized the very real possibility that those emergency services might be needed. 2,000 feet, Peterson called out. The aircraft was now committed to the approach. Even if they wanted to abort the landing, the combination of system failures and reduced power would make climbing away from the airport extremely difficult. Harold's experience told him they were past the point of no return, and everything now depended on executing the landing with precision that left no margin for error. "Power back slightly," Harold instructed. "Let the nose come down just a degree or two. We want to be stable before we cross the runway threshold." The runway was growing larger in the windscreen, and Harold could see the touchdown zone markings that would guide their final moments in the air. But something was wrong with their approach angle. They were coming in slightly high and fast, which would normally be correctable with standard procedures. However, with their degraded control authority, standard corrections might not be sufficient. "We're a little high," Peterson observed, his voice tense. "I see it," Harold replied calmly. Dondi T tried to dive for the runway. Instead, reduce power more aggressively and let the aircraft settle naturally. Better to float a little long than to arrive short and hard. George Strait moved closer to the cockpit, his eyes fixed on the approaching runway. Harold noticed that the Country Star AS hands were clenched at his sides, but his presence seemed to provide additional stability to the situation. There was something about having someone of George S. stature witnessing their efforts that made Harold even more determined to succeed. 1,000 feet, Peterson announced. Harold could feel the aircraft's behavior changing as they approached landing speed. The controls were becoming increasingly sluggish, and Peterson was having to make larger inputs to achieve the same responses. This was the most dangerous phase of the approach. Low, slow, and with minimal control authority remaining. 500 feet on glide path. The runway was now filling their entire field of view, and Harold could see individual details of the concrete surface. Emergency vehicles were positioned along both sides of the runway, their crews standing ready to respond to whatever happened in the next 60 seconds. Harold had seen similar scenes during his military career, and he knew that those first responders were probably more nervous than the people in the cockpit. Looking good, Harold said, though he could see Peterson was struggling with the controls. Maintain current power setting. Don T, change anything unless I tell you. At 200 feet, a crosswind gust caught the aircraft and pushed them slightly off the runway centerline. Peterson instinctively moved to correct, but Harold placed a restraining hand on his arm. Easy correction, Harold said. Small inputs. Let the aircraft stabilize before making another adjustment. The runway threshold passed beneath them, and Harold felt the familiar sensation of an aircraft transitioning from flight to landing. But something was still wrong. Their approach speed was higher than normal due to the degraded flight controls, which meant they would touch down faster and require more runway to stop. Harold hoped the airport AS runway was long enough to accommodate their extended landing roll. 50 feet, 40, 30. Peterson was fighting to keep the aircraft aligned with the runway centerline, his inputs becoming more aggressive as the controls continued to lose effectiveness. Harold could see the tension in the captain's shoulders and knew that the younger pilot was approaching the limits of his experience and training. 20 feet, 10. Flare now, but gently. The moment of truth had arrived. Peterson pulled back on the controls to arrest their descent, but the aircraft's response was delayed and insufficient. They were going to hit the runway harder than normal, and Harold braced himself for the impact that would determine whether their emergency procedures had been successful. The main landing gear touched the concrete with a jarring thud that sent vibrations through the entire aircraft structure. The nose gear followed a second later with another solid impact, and suddenly they were rolling down the runway at nearly 200 miles per hour with questionable braking capability. Reverse thrust, Harold called out, and Peterson activated the engine reverse thrusters with movements that had become automatic despite the stress. The aircraft began to slow, but they were still traveling much faster than normal for this phase of landing. Brakes are working, but not at full effectiveness, Peterson reported, his voice tight with concentration. Harold watched their speed indicator and calculated their position on the runway. They had used more concrete than normal for the landing itself, and now they were consuming runway length at an alarming rate as they tried to bring the aircraft to a complete stop. "We're going to be fine," Harold said, though he wasn't entirely certain. "Keep steady pressure on the brakes," but Doherty locked them up. And the emergency vehicles were now pacing them along the runway edges, ready to respond if the aircraft departed the runway surface, or if fire developed in the overheated brakes and tires. Harold could see the foam trucks maintaining position, their crews probably wondering whether they would need to deploy their equipment. At 50 miles per hour, Harold finally allowed himself to believe they were going to succeed. The aircraft was still rolling straight down the runway centerline. The brakes were functioning well enough to bring them to a stop, and there were no signs of fire or structural damage from the hard landing. 30 miles per hour. 20. 10. Flight 327 came to a complete stop, with nearly 1,000 feet of runway remaining. For a moment, the cockpit was silent except for the sound of cooling engines and the distant wail of emergency vehicle sirens. Then Captain Peterson turned to Harold with an expression of profound gratitude and relief. "Colonel, I don't know how to thank you. Without your help, we never would have made it." Harold felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him as the adrenaline of the past hour began to subside. But before he could respond, George Strait was beside him, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Colonel Mitchell," George said, his voice filled with emotion, "what you just did was nothing short of miraculous. You saved every life on this aircraft." Through the cockpit windows, Harold could see passengers beginning to stand and move toward the exits, their faces showing the relief and joy of people who had just survived something they thought might kill them. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft, but their crews were standing down from full alert status now that it was clear the landing had been successful. The flight attendants were beginning evacuation procedures, though the emergency slides wouldn't be needed since the aircraft had come to rest normally on the runway. Harold could hear cheering from the passenger cabin as people realized they were safely on the ground and uninjured. "Wish we should get you back to your seat," Captain Peterson said. "The investigation teams are going to want to interview everyone, and there will be paperwork and debriefings." But Harold wasn't thinking about paperwork or investigations. He was thinking about Jimmy, about the friend he had been traveling to visit, about the irony that his journey to honor one life had resulted in saving more than 100 others. The emergency had prevented him from reaching Los Angeles, but somehow it felt like Jimmy would have approved of how the day had turned out. George Strait helped Harold navigate back through the aircraft to his seat in the last row, where Marcus was waiting with tears in his eyes and gratitude written across his face. Other passengers were looking at Harold with expressions ranging from curiosity to awe, though most of them didn't yet understand exactly what role the elderly man in the faded shirt had played in their survival. As emergency crews began their post-incident procedures and passengers prepared to disembark, Harold settled back into seat 34F and closed his eyes. He had missed his connection to Los Angeles, had spent most of his remaining money on a trip that wouldn't reach its intended destination, and would probably face hours of questioning from federal investigators. But 128 people were alive who might not have been, and Harold Mitchell had once again proved that experience, training, and quiet courage could triumph over seemingly impossible circumstances. The debriefing process took 6 hours. Federal Aviation Administration investigators, airline executives, and airport security personnel all wanted to understand exactly what had happened during those critical 17 minutes when Flight 327 had transformed from a routine commercial flight into a life-or-death emergency. Harold found himself in a conference room at Tulsa International Airport, surrounded by officials who treated him with a mixture of respect and bureaucratic wariness. "Colonel Mitchell," said the lead FAA investigator, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and sharp eyes, "your intervention in the cockpit was highly irregular. While the outcome was successful, we need to understand the legal implications of a passenger assuming co-pilot duties during an emergency." Harold nodded patiently. He had expected this conversation and understood the officials' concerns. Aviation safety depended on strict adherence to procedures and protocols, and his actions had definitely fallen outside normal parameters. But he also understood that sometimes extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary responses. I never assumed co-pilot duties," Harold replied carefully. "I provided consultation and guidance to Captain Peterson, who maintained full command authority throughout the emergency. My suggestions were based on military experience with similar system failures, and Captain Peterson evaluated each recommendation before implementation." Captain Peterson, who had been sitting quietly during most of the questioning, spoke up. "Colonel Mitchell saved this aircraft and everyone on it. I've been flying for 15 years, and I've never encountered anything like what we faced today. Without his expertise, we would have crashed." The airline executives looked uncomfortable with Peterson's blunt assessment. Harold could see they were worried about liability issues and public relations problems. The last thing they wanted was media coverage, suggesting their pilots were inadequately trained for emergency situations. But the facts were clear. A 78-year-old passenger had provided critical assistance that prevented a catastrophic accident. While the officials continued their discussions, Harold's thoughts kept returning to the missed connection to Los Angeles. His hotel reservation had been cancelled. His return flight was obviously not happening, and he had no clear path to complete the journey he had planned for months. The irony wasn't lost on him that saving lives had prevented him from honoring his dead friend, but Harold felt no bitterness about the situation. George Strait had remained at the airport throughout the debriefing process, despite having his own travel arrangements to manage. The country star had rescheduled his commitments and was waiting patiently in the terminal, occasionally checking with airport staff about Harold's status. When the formal interviews finally concluded, George was there to meet Harold as he emerged from the conference room. "Colonel, how are you holding up?" George asked, genuine concern evident in his voice. "I'm fine, Mr. Strait. Just tired. It has been a long day. Please call me George, and I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of making some phone calls while you were in there." George's expression was serious but warm. "I heard you mention to one of the investigators that you were traveling to visit a friend's grave in Los Angeles." Harold nodded. "My old wingman from Vietnam, Jimmy Rodriguez. I've been saving up for this trip for 8 months, but I guess it wasn't meant to be." George studied Harold's face for a moment, seeing the quiet disappointment the older man was trying to hide. "Tell me about Jimmy." For the next 20 minutes, sitting in an airport coffee shop that had stayed open late for the emergency passengers, Harold told George about his friendship with Jimmy Rodriguez. He described their tours over Vietnam, the missions they had flown together, the times Jimmy had saved his life, and the times Harold had returned the favor. He talked about Jimmy's family, his post-war struggles with what would later be recognized as PTSD, and his death from cancer 2 years earlier. George listened intently, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just absorbing the story of 2 young men who had risked everything for their country and for each other. As Harold spoke, George began to understand that the heroism he had witnessed on the aircraft wasn't an isolated incident. Harold Mitchell was someone who had spent his entire life putting others before himself, serving his country in war and continuing to serve in peacetime, even when that service went unrecognized and unrewarded. "Harold," George said when the story was complete, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. If you could have anything you wanted right now, what would it be?" Harold smiled sadly. "To visit Jimmy's grave and tell him about today. He would have gotten a kick out of this whole situation. Jimmy always said I was too stubborn to know when to quit." George nodded thoughtfully. "What if I told you that's exactly what's going to happen? What if I told you we are going to Los Angeles tonight on my private jet, and tomorrow you were going to visit your friend's grave?" Harold stared at George in disbelief. "Mr. Strait, George, I appreciate the offer, but I can't accept that kind of generosity. You don't even know me." "I know enough," George replied firmly. "I know you risked your life today to save strangers. I know you've served your country with honor. I know you spent 8 months saving money for a trip to honor a fallen friend, and I know that kind of character deserves recognition and support." And before Harold could protest further, George continued, "But that is not all. I've made some other phone calls today. I called the President of the United States." Harold's eyes widened. "You what?" "I called President Trump, told him what happened on that aircraft today, told him about your military service and your actions during the emergency. Harold, did you know that you were recommended for the Medal of Honor after a mission over North Vietnam in 1971? Harold felt the blood drain from his face. How could you possibly know that? Because the president had his staff pull your military records. The recommendation was filed by your commanding officer after you single-handedly saved a damaged B-52 and its crew during a mission that AS still classified. But the paperwork got lost in the bureaucracy during the drawdown of forces, and the medal was never awarded. Harold sat in stunned silence. He remembered the mission George was referring to, a nightmare flight when their bomber had been hit by surface-to-air missiles, and Harold had managed to keep it airborne long enough to reach friendly territory. 3 crew members had been wounded, and Harold had flown the damaged aircraft for 2 hours while under enemy fire. But he had never heard anything about a Medal of Honor recommendation. "The President wants to correct that oversight," George continued. "He is flying to Los Angeles tomorrow for a veterans event, and he wants to present you with the Medal of Honor that should have been yours 50 years ago." Harold felt tears forming in his eyes. "I don't understand. Why would he do that?" "Because heroes should be recognized, Harold, because your service matters, because what you did today matters, and because sometimes the system gets it right, even if it takes half a century." The next 24 hours passed in a blur of private jets, media interviews, and official ceremonies. Harold found himself in Los Angeles, standing at Jimmy Rodriguez's grave in Forest Lawn Cemetery, finally able to have the conversation he had traveled so far to complete. He told Jimmy about the emergency landing, about George Strait's kindness, and about the impossible turn his life had taken. "You always said I was lucky, Jimmy," Harold whispered to the headstone. "I guess you were right." The medal ceremony took place at the Los Angeles Veterans Administration Hospital, with hundreds of veterans, active military personnel, and media representatives in attendance. President Trump presented Harold with the Medal of Honor in a ceremony that was broadcast live across the nation. But for Harold, the most meaningful moment came when George Strait took the podium. "Harold Mitchell represents the best of America," George told the assembled crowd. "He served his country in war, he continued to serve in peace, and when circumstances called for heroism, he answered without hesitation. But Harold also represents something else, the thousands of veterans who return home and quietly go about their lives, asking for nothing, expecting little recognition, but always ready to serve when needed." But George announced the establishment of the Mitchell Veterans Support Fund, a foundation that would provide assistance to elderly veterans facing financial hardship. The initial funding would come from a benefit concert series that George planned to perform across the country. Harold tried to object to having his name attached to the foundation, but George was adamant. "Your name represents what this is all about," George insisted. "Service, sacrifice, and the quiet dignity of people who do the right thing, because it's the right thing, not because they expect recognition." 6 months later, Harold Mitchell was living in a modest but comfortable house in a veteran-friendly community outside Dallas. His financial worries ended by the pension George had quietly arranged through the Veterans Foundation. He volunteered at the local VA hospital, sharing his experiences with younger veterans and helping them navigate the sometimes complex world of post-military life. The aircraft emergency had made Harold briefly famous, but fame wasn't to what mattered to him. What mattered was that his story had inspired legislation to improve support for aging veterans, that the foundation bearing his name had helped hundreds of former service members, and that Jimmy Rodriguez's grave now received regular visits from other veterans who had heard Harold's story. On quiet evenings, Harold would sit on his front porch and think about the strange chain of events that had transformed his life. A trip to honor a dead friend had become an opportunity to save lives, which had led to recognition he never sought, and resources he never expected. It was, he thought, exactly the kind of ironic twist that Jimmy would have appreciated. The worn leather wallet still contained $47.32. Harold had kept the bills as a reminder of where he had come from. But now it also contained a card with George Strait's personal phone number, a photo from the Medal of Honor ceremony, and a letter from a young veteran whose life had been changed by the Foundation's assistance. Harold Mitchell had learned that heroism wasn't a T about seeking recognition or reward. It was about being ready when circumstances demanded action, about having the courage to step forward when others stepped back, and about understanding that sometimes the most important moments in life come disguised as ordinary challenges. As he had told the media during one of his interviews, "I was just trying to help. That is what you do when people need help. You don't think about the consequences or the recognition, you just do what needs to be done." The story of Flight 327 had ended with everyone walking away safely, but for Harold Mitchell, it had been the beginning of a new chapter in a life that proved it as never too late for extraordinary things to happen to ordinary people who possess the quiet courage to act when action is needed most.